The 1980s were a golden era for pop culture, and one of the defining phenomena of that decade was Ghostbusters. The movie, released in 1984, was an instant classic mixing comedy, science fiction, and supernatural elements. With the immense popularity of the movie, it was only a matter of time before the Ghostbusters franchise expanded into the video game world. In 1986, Ghostbusters made its way onto the Nintendo Entertainment System. The game sought to capture the spirit of the movie, with its iconic characters, recognizable theme music, and ghost-catching action. The NES version of Ghostbusters was developed by Activision, one of the early pioneers in the video game industry. The game was designed by David Crane, a well-known figure in the gaming world who was also the mastermind behind Pitfall, on the Atari 2600. Crane's involvement was a major selling point for Ghostbusters, as he had a reputation for creating engaging and innovative games. The development for the NES was influenced heavily by earlier versions of the game, which had appeared on computers like the Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and Amstrad CPC. These early versions were relatively successful, and the NES port was largely based on the original Commodore 64 game. Unfortunately, due to hardware limitations and the pressure to quickly release the game to capitalize on the movie's success, the NES version retained many of the flaws of its predecessors. The result was a game that was somewhat clunky and confusing, especially compared to the streamlined action games that were beginning to emerge on the NES during that period. Despite the mixed reception, Ghostbusters for the NES remains a notable part of the franchise's gaming history, showcasing the challenges of adapting blockbuster movies to the constraints of early video game consoles. The storyline is loosely based on the plot of the 1984 movie. The goal of the game is straightforward. The player controls the Ghostbusters team as they travel around New York City, capturing ghosts and earning money. The ultimate objective is to earn enough cash to upgrade equipment and eventually confront the supernatural menace in the Zuul Building, just like in the movie. However, the game doesn't follow the movie's narrative closely. Instead, it offers a simplified and somewhat abstract version of the story, focusing more on the ghost-busting activities than the plot-driven elements of the movie. Players are given the freedom to roam the streets of New York, capturing ghosts and collecting resources, but the lack of a cohesive narrative left some fans of the movie disappointed. Nevertheless, the familiar elements, like the Ghostbusters logo, theme song, and some of the gadgets, do appear in the game, keeping the experience tied to the source material. The gameplay is a blend of strategy, resource management, and arcade-style action. The player's objective is to navigate the Ghostbusters team through the city, capture ghosts, and prepare for the final showdown in the Zuul Building. The game begins with a city map of New York, where the player selects a location to visit. The map shows buildings with increasing levels of supernatural activity, represented by flashing lights. Players must act quickly to reach these locations before they are overrun with ghosts. Driving from the Ghostbusters headquarters to a haunted location involves a mini-game where players must navigate the Ecto-1, the famous Ghostbusters car, while avoiding obstacles and collecting fuel. This segment of the game was criticized for its repetitive nature, as it's required every time you move to a new location. Once you reach a haunted building, the game shifts to the ghost-catching mode. Players must use a trap and proton pack to capture ghosts floating around the screen. This is one of the more iconic parts of the game, as it directly references the movie's ghost-busting action. The ghost-catching mechanics are simple but frustrating, as the controls can be imprecise, making it difficult to line up your shots and successfully capture ghosts. Timing is key, and players need to carefully manage their equipment to avoid getting overwhelmed. Money plays a crucial role. At the start, players must purchase their equipment, including traps, ghost bait, and upgrades for the Ecto-1. Capturing ghosts rewards the player with money, which can be used to buy better gear to handle tougher hauntings. This resource management aspect was unique at the time, adding a layer of strategy to the game. However, the process of earning money and upgrading gear can feel repetitive, as the player must grind through similar ghost-catching scenarios multiple times. After earning enough money and capturing a sufficient number of ghosts, players can enter the Zuul Building for the final challenge. The building requires climbing multiple floors, avoiding ghosts, and dodging obstacles. This segment is a test of endurance, as the player must conserve energy and carefully make their way to the top. The climax of the game, like much of the experience, is hampered by clunky controls and a lack of precision, making the final levels frustratingly difficult for many players. One of the most memorable and mocked aspects of the game is the speech synthesis. Upon starting the game, players are greeted with a digitized voice saying, "Ghostbusters." Although primitive by today's standards, this was a notable feature in the 1980s, showcasing the NES's capability to produce limited speech. The quality of the synthesized voice became a nostalgic, if humorous, element for fans. David Crane, the designer behind Ghostbusters for the NES, was a well-known developer who had a significant influence on early video game design. Crane's earlier work on the Atari 2600 and other classic systems gave him credibility, but his adaptation remains one of his more controversial projects due to its divisive reception. Many of the game's features were carried over from the original Commodore 64 version, including the map navigation, ghost catching mechanics, and resource management. This reuse of elements led to a mixed response, as some players appreciated the continuity, while others criticized it for feeling outdated on the more advanced NES hardware. Unlike many NES games that were adaptations of popular movies, Ghostbusters didn't follow the plot of the movie very closely. The game's lack of narrative cohesion was a point of criticism, as many fans of the movie were hoping for a more cinematic experience that captured the story's humor, characters, and iconic moments. It was one of the early NES titles that experimented with combining multiple gameplay styles into a single game. The driving sections, ghost-catching segments, and resource management elements were all distinct, creating a varied experience. However, the lack of polish in these minigames sometimes detracted from the overall fun. It was widely criticized for its frustrating controls, repetitive gameplay, and failure to capture the essence of the movie. However, over the years, it has become a cult classic, with fans appreciating its nostalgic charm and early attempts at combining strategy with action. The game's flaws have become endearing quirks, making it a beloved oddity in the NES library. The game was notorious for its steep difficulty curve. The final challenge in the Zuul Building was especially tough, with players needing to carefully manage their resources, time jumps perfectly, and avoid relentless ghosts. This challenge is often cited as one of the hardest segments in early NES gaming, leading to both frustration and a sense of accomplishment for those who managed to beat it. The development was challenging due to the hardware limitations of the system and the need to translate a complex movie into a simple yet engaging game. The 8-bit era didn't allow for the cinematic storytelling that modern games can achieve, so the developers had to simplify the movie's story into a game that could be played in short bursts. Creating a game that combined multiple gameplay styles, like driving, strategy, and arcade action, was ambitious for the time, and fitting all of these elements into a single cartridge was a technical achievement. The game's soundtrack, though repetitive, managed to recreate the Ghostbusters theme song with the limited NES sound chip, giving fans a recognizable connection to the movie. Ghostbusters is a fascinating case study of early movie-to-game adaptations. It shows both the potential and pitfalls of adapting a blockbuster movie into an 8-bit game. While it's far from a perfect experience, the game remains a nostalgic trip for those who grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, offering a glimpse into the challenges of early video game development. Whether you love it for its quirks or criticize it for its flaws, there's no denying that Ghostbusters for the NES holds a unique place in gaming history. The game stands as a reminder of how far the industry has come and how iconic franchises were first brought into the digital world.